Continuing with our same subtitle, Major Movements. So the next two movements that we're going to talk about are two that are led by and geared towards women and women's issues. So the first of these is women's suffrage. Suffrage means the right to vote. So this movement is the movement that focused on gaining women the right to vote for their representatives, and hopefully in the future, the right even to hold office. So this movement really kicked off in 1848 with the famous Seneca Falls Convention. Now, the Seneca Falls Convention was a meeting of women from all over the country who supported women's rights and women's issues, and they met to talk about women's rights and to talk about, in particular, the need for women to be able to vote and to form a plan on how that was going to happen. And in that meeting, they were led by three main women: Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott, and Susan B. Anthony. Hopefully, you recognize all of those names, or at least a few of them. But these women were incredibly important and were the main reason why they ended up gaining the vote for women. Now, these three women became the main leaders of this movement, and in the Seneca Falls Convention, Stanton wrote the Declaration of Sentiments, which was a document listing women's problems, and she actually modeled the Declaration of Sentiments on the Declaration of Independence. A few slides from now, you'll see a quote and a picture of the Declaration of Sentiments and the signatures on it, and a quote from that echoes strongly the wording in the Declaration of Independence. And Elizabeth Cady Stanton herself, you can see on the right-hand side of the screen. So, women's suffrage was pushing for the right to vote, but they also pushed for more rights for women beyond just voting rights. One of those was the right to divorce their husbands, which they saw as a major issue because women were mostly unable to get out of marriages, even if those were perhaps abusive or and otherwise problematic. So they started pushing for that as well. The women who were part of the women's suffrage movement, though, largely never got to see the results of the movement. Elizabeth Cady Stanton died in 1902. A few of the other women later in that same decade. And this was still years before women were granted the right to vote. Women were actually granted the right to vote in 1920, most women, that is. So many of them pushed for these rights, but they never got to exercise those rights themselves. Now, women's suffrage is also sometimes referred to as first wave feminism. I just want you to know both terms. So in terms of the history of feminism, first wave feminism revolves around the right to vote and lasts until 1920, when women are granted the right to vote. Now, the second movement is the temperance movement. And the temperance movement is the movement against alcohol consumption. So advocating for outlawing alcohol or for people just abstaining from consuming alcohol. This movement did include both men and women, but it is actually a women's issue. And it might not initially seem like mainly a women's issue. Because in our modern day, with the history in the 1920s where temperance was actually achieved and prohibition started, banning alcohol, we kind of have this perception that everybody involved in the temperance movement just didn't want people to have fun, right? But that is very much not the case. For it was really a women's issue because men were the ones who tended to drink more alcohol and were the ones who tended to be more violent as a result of that alcohol. And they could potentially come home and take out that violence on their wives. And their wives and their children were kind of stuck in that situation. And so women started advocating for alcohol to be illegal or for people to stop using alcohol to kind of lessen the impact of that on families who couldn't really avoid it. So that's what we're really talking about here. The next few slides, you'll see some pictures of the leaders and of the suffragettes.